To my daughter, Eleanor, I leave nothing. 7 words in a will, read aloud in a lawyer's office on an ordinary Tuesday. No house, no money, not even a photograph off a shelf. The daughter stood up, walked out, and drove home believing her father had spent his last years hating her. Everyone else in that room thought she'd earned it. She'd abandoned the old man, they said, right when he needed her. For 11 months, that was the entire story. Then the lawyer opened a drawer. Inside was a second letter, sealed in wax, one line written across the front in the dead man's hand. Open only if she is left with nothing. He had written a letter that could only be read if his own daughter was cut out completely, which meant he'd known she would be, which meant the will the whole family had just fought over was doing precisely what he wanted. This is the story of a daughter everyone called a traitor, and the trap her father spent 2 years building to prove them all wrong, long after he was already in the ground. A betrayal like this needs 3 people: the man who was robbed, the daughter they blamed, and the woman who walked in through the front door and carried out everything he owned. Start with the man. Harold Whitmore built his company out of a rented garage and one second-hand bandsaw. 40 years on, 140 families in Ashford, Ohio drew their paychecks from his floor, and he knew every name on it. When a foreman couldn't cover his boys' braces one hard winter, the bill quietly vanished, and Harold never once said whose hand had paid it. But the thing Harold loved was never the mill. It was a girl on an overturned crate. Eleanor was 6 the first time he stood her at the bench and folded her small fingers around a chisel. Light touch, he told her. Let the tool do the work. She ruined the cut. He laughed, blew the shaving away, and lined the chisel up again. Once more, she had better hands than any man he ever hired, and he told her so for the rest of his life. Then she grew up and surprised him. She didn't want the mill. She became a nurse and chose the hardest room in the building. Hospice. She spent her nights sitting with strangers as they died, so that not one of them had to do it alone. Harold kept a photo of her in her scrubs on his desk, angled so he'd catch it every time he looked up from his work. That house had already seen one long goodbye. Years earlier, when Harold's first wife, Ellie's mother, was dying, it was Ellie who moved back into her childhood bedroom to nurse her through the end. She bathed her, sat up with her through the worst nights, and held her hand when it finally went still. Harold stood in the doorway that last night and watched his daughter do the hardest work there is. "You've got your mother's hands," he told her once, his voice rough. "And her spine." It was the house where Ellie learned that staying until the end is its own kind of love. It was the house Vivian would one day lock her out of. His son Daniel stayed. Every morning Daniel put on the Whitmore name and walked the same floor his father had built. And every morning he measured himself against a sister who'd left and came up short in his own mind. One evening near closing, Daniel came up to the office and asked for an advance. "Cash flow," he said. "Nothing unusual." Harold signed the check without looking up, then stopped, pen still on the paper. "That's 3 times this year, Danny." Daniel gave him the easy grin everyone liked. "Last time. Promise." It was not the last time. It was not close. A month later, Marcus, the old foreman, Harold's friend of 30 years, found Daniel out by the loading dock at night, talking low to 2 men neither of them recognized. When Daniel saw him, the men left, and Daniel laughed it off. "Buddies from the gym." Marcus didn't believe him, and Marcus didn't tell Harold, and he would carry that choice for a long time. Because what Harold's son had gotten himself into wasn't the gym. It was a debt with a number attached that could end a man. You'll hear that number before the end. Then, 9 years after his first wife died, Harold met Vivian. It happened at a charity dinner. She was poised, well-read, the sort of company that makes a widower feel like a man again instead of a patient. 6 months later, they married. At the reception, Harold danced for the first time in a decade, and half the town said how good it was to see him happy at last. Ellie watched from the edge of the room and couldn't make her hands unclench. She'd spent a career at the bedsides of the dying. And that work teaches you to notice the people who drift toward the sick right as there's something to inherit. She had no proof, only a feeling, and the way Vivian's eyes moved around the room, quietly counting. The changes came slow. At the next family dinner, Ellie asked how Harold's cardiologist was treating him. Vivian set down her fork. "We've switched doctors," she said, smiling. "He prefers the new one." Harold opened his mouth, then shut it, and reached for his water. He didn't correct her. Ellie noticed that too. There was a woman named Grace who had cleaned the Whitmore house 2 mornings a week for 20 years. Grace adored Harold, and Grace started to see things she didn't like. That Harold's afternoon pills came from a box only Vivian touched, that he dozed more and spoke less, that some days he called Grace by his late wife's name. One morning Grace mentioned, carefully, that maybe a doctor should have a look at how tired he'd become. She was let go by the end of that week. "He finds the noise upsetting," Vivian explained at the door. Grace stood in the driveway with her last check and understood she'd been removed for the crime of paying attention. Within the year, Harold's phone stopped reaching Harold. Ellie would call, and Vivian would answer. "He's resting. He's not up to it today. I'll let him know you rang." The messages never seemed to arrive. Ellie mailed birthday cards. She never learned whether he read them. Then the locks changed. For security, Vivian said. Then the standing Sunday dinner slid to Thursdays, the nights Ellie worked her shifts and couldn't come. One July afternoon, Ellie drove over unannounced and stood on the porch of the house she grew up in. Through the front window, she could see her father in his chair, a blanket across his knees in the middle of summer. She lifted her hand to knock. Vivian stepped into the window, met her daughter's eyes through the glass, and drew the curtain shut. Ellie sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. Then she drove home. She would never stand on that porch again. There's a name for what was being done to Harold. In elder care, they call it isolation, walling a vulnerable person off from anyone who might notice what's happening to him. Ellie had watched it hollow out other families from the inside. She'd never once pictured herself on the wrong side of the glass. But she was a nurse before she was a daughter, and she began to watch the way she'd watch a failing patient. Her father, a man who could quote the price of walnut board from 1985, was suddenly too confused to sign his own checks. There were pill bottles on the counter no one had explained. The accountant who'd kept the mill's books for 30 years was gone, replaced by a name she didn't know. And then, sorting a stack of her father's mail she'd been handed months earlier, back when she could still get through the door, she found a bank statement she was never meant to see. A transfer, then another, large, regular, routed to a company she'd never heard of and labeled, on paper, as Care Services. She drove straight over and asked Vivian, as gently as she could, about the money. Vivian didn't blink. She opened the door a little wider, so the neighbors on the step could hear it too. "I think," she said, "that you've always been more interested in his accounts than in him." And that quickly, the daughter trying to protect Harold became the daughter circling his estate. That was the version that spread through town. Eleanor, the grasping one. Eleanor, who only ever wanted the money. 3 years before Harold died, Ellie stopped going. Not because she stopped loving him, because every visit was turned into evidence, and she couldn't win a fight where the truth kept getting rewritten under her feet. She told herself he was safe. She told herself she was imagining it. The one thing she couldn't tell herself, the thought that kept her awake for 3 years, was the worst one. That somewhere behind that curtain, her own father now believed she had walked out on him. Before we go further, I want your honest take, because everything ahead turns on it. Imagine it's your father. You see the wrong pills, the changed locks, the money going missing, and every single person in your life tells you you're imagining things. What do? Push harder and risk being cut off for good? Or step back to keep the peace, the way Ellie did, and pray you're wrong? Tell me in the comments. I read them, because Ellie's story was far from finished, and the lawyer had said nothing yet about the second envelope. Harold died on a gray October morning. Ellie found out from Marcus, the old foreman, who called her in tears assuming she already knew. Nobody had called her. She wasn't told about the funeral, and she stood at the back of it anyway, in the rain, while people she'd known her whole life looked straight through her. 11 days later, the will was read. Ellie nearly didn't go. What changed her mind was a phone call from Thomas Bell, her father's lawyer of 40 years, a slow, careful man who chose his words like he was paying cash for each one. "Be in the room, Eleanor," was all he'd say. "You'll want to be in the room." He wouldn't explain. She would think about that call for a long time. The will read exactly the way Vivian and Daniel expected. The house, to Vivian. Controlling shares in the mill, to Daniel. Cash and property, split between them. Then Bell reached the last name on the page, and the room went still. "To my daughter, Eleanor, I leave nothing." Daniel let out a slow breath, like a man setting down something heavy. Vivian folded her hands and did not smile. She was far too careful to smile. Ellie was out the door before anyone could study her face. For Vivian, the months that followed were a victory lap. She listed the house. She moved money. By every legal measure that exists, she had won. But Thomas Bell couldn't sleep. Bell had drafted every will Harold ever signed, and the last one sat wrong in his chest. Not the words, the timing. 6 weeks before he died, Harold had come to the office alone, which, given how closely he was watched, must have taken real planning. He'd set a sealed envelope on the desk and given one instruction, in the flat voice he used when he'd already decided something. "Lock it away. Don't read it at the will. Open it only when the estate is settled, and only if Eleanor is left with nothing." Bell had asked what it was. Harold said one word: insurance. Then he shook his lawyer's hand a beat too long, the way a man does when he's saying a goodbye he isn't allowed to announce. Bell had done one more thing that day that he told no one about. On his way out, Harold had stopped in the doorway and said, "Whatever they tell you about my girl, Thomas, you knew me longer than any of them." Then he'd gone. Bell hadn't understood it. Now he couldn't stop hearing it. The condition was inching toward true. The estate was nearly settled. Eleanor had nothing, and Bell was beginning to understand that his oldest client had known, to the letter, exactly how this would play out. Ellie couldn't let it go either. Not the money, the math. She kept circling those transfers. So she did what her father had taught her at that bench: start at the beginning and follow the grain. She started with Grace, the housekeeper. Over coffee at a diner, Grace told her everything she'd been too afraid to say for years. The pillbox only Vivian touched, the tiredness that came on too fast, the day she was fired for suggesting a doctor. "I should have called you," Grace said. "I didn't have your number, and I was scared." Ellie reached across the table and held her hand, and told her it wasn't her fault. Then she drove home and cried in the garage so her own family wouldn't hear it. Next, she found the accountant who'd been replaced, 30 years on the mill's books, pushed out in a month. He wouldn't meet in person. On the phone, he said only one thing worth writing down. "When I asked who authorized the new payment schedule, I was told it wasn't my concern anymore. So I stopped asking. That's my regret." Then he hung up. Marcus found her next. The old foreman had been carrying something for months, and it came out of him in the mill parking lot with his cap twisting in his hands. He told her about the night he'd seen Daniel down by the loading dock with 2 men who didn't belong there. "I should have told your dad," Marcus said. "I told myself I was protecting the boy." Ellie understood then that her brother's debts were real, and that for a while, they had made Daniel the easiest man in Ashford to blame, which, she was beginning to see, was exactly what someone had been counting on. She brought it all to Bell, and he laid the estate records beside her bank statements, and the two of them saw it in the same second. The transfers hadn't started recently. They'd started 6 years back, almost to the week of Harold's wedding. A tap, opened the day Vivian arrived, and running ever since. So they chased the company the money had vanished into, the one billed as Care Services. On paper, it was a tidy little management firm with a post office box and no employees. But Bell knew how to read a shell, and when he pulled the filing, The registered agent listed wasn't Vivian Whitmore. It was a name neither of them recognized, until Ellie matched it, an hour later, to Vivian's maiden name from 30 years back. The company that had drained her father dry had been created 8 days before the wedding. 8 days before Vivian ever said, "I do." The machine to empty Harold Whitmore was already built and waiting. Ellie stared at that date until the numbers blurred. It told her the one thing the transfers alone hadn't. This was never a marriage that went wrong. It was a plan that went exactly right. The obvious answer was Daniel. Motive stitched into every seam. The debts, the resentment, his hands on the mill's books. Bell pulled the company accounts half expecting to find it there. And what he found nearly convinced him. By the time his father died, Daniel Whitmore owed a little over $2 million to people who don't send letters. A man that desperate will do almost anything. Then a small thing stopped Bell cold. It was Vivian who had first pointed him toward Daniel. Weeks earlier she'd mentioned, gently, in passing, that the family really ought to take a closer look at Daniel's spending. At the time it had sounded like worry. Now Bell turned it over and heard it clean. The one who points first is usually pointing away from themselves. He stopped looking at Daniel. He started looking at her. Vivian felt the ground shift before she could name it. A week after Ellie started asking questions, she appeared at Bell's office without an appointment, sat down uninvited, and folded her gloves in her lap. "Thomas," she said, warm as a Sunday morning, "I'm worried about Eleanor. All this digging, it isn't healthy. People who can't accept it will sometimes do reckless things." Bell said nothing. "And I'd hate," she went on, smoothing the gloves, "for a man your age to spend his last good years tangled up in someone else's grief. You've earned your rest." She smiled, rose, and let herself out. It was the most graceful threat Bell had heard in 40 years at the bar, and it did the opposite of what she wanted. Because Vivian only came to close a door when she was afraid of what stood behind it. Bell drove to the county courthouse that same afternoon and started pulling records with his own hands. So he and Ellie pulled Vivian's history, and what came up turned Ellie cold. She had done this before. Twice. 2 marriages, both to older men with money. Both times she left richer than she arrived. Both times, grown children raised the alarm. And both times, those children were painted as greedy and unstable and pushed out of the frame, the exact same way Ellie had been. One script. 3 families. Ellie's was only the newest. Ellie tracked down a daughter from the second family and called her, a stranger, out of the blue. The woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Let me guess. They told everyone you only wanted the money." Ellie couldn't answer. "They told everyone that about me too," the woman said. "I'm sorry. Nobody believed me either." Ellie sat in her car afterward and understood at last that she had never been paranoid. She had only been early. And then they hit the wall. Because a pattern is not a crime. Every transfer had been signed by Harold's own hand. In the very years the family swore he was too far gone to run his own affairs. On paper, a devoted husband had made generous gifts to his wife. The money was spent. Harold was gone. The will said Eleanor got nothing. Bell said it to her plainly, because she deserved plainness. They had the truth, and not one piece of it a court would take. They had lost. For a week, that was where it sat. Ellie stopped calling. Vivian's house sale closed. The winners had won. Then Bell looked at the calendar, and his hand went to the drawer. The estate was settled. Eleanor had nothing. Every last condition Harold had set was quietly, finally, met. For the first time in 11 months, the old man's letter was his to open. He called Ellie back to the office, put on his glasses, and slid the blade under the wax. 3 pages, in Harold's hand. He read the first line aloud, and the room changed. "Thomas, if you're reading this, it worked. Ellie's sitting across from you with nothing, and the rest of them think they've won. Good. Let me tell you what they actually did." Harold had known. All of it. He was not a confused old man robbed in the dark. He was a man who had worked out exactly what was being done to him, and let it happen, so that he could catch it. "I let her think I was slipping," Some days I let the pills do their work and I sat there like a ghost, and I listened. You'd be amazed what people say in front of a man they've decided isn't there anymore. Every check they waved off, I copied. Every account she opened in my name, I kept the paper. Go to the box, Thomas. You know the one. Belle knew the one. A safe deposit box Harold had held for decades at a bank across the county line, under a key Vivian never knew existed. Belle drove out that same afternoon. Inside was 2 years of evidence, statements, signatures, dates, a ledger in Harold's own careful hand. Every dollar Vivian moved, documented from the inside, by the one man nobody thought to suspect. The victim. It was enough to blow the whole thing open. Ellie thought that was the twist. It was only the first. Belle turned to the second page, and Harold's plan opened up beneath them like a floor giving way. The will they read you is real. It's also nearly empty. A year before I died, I moved everything that mattered, the land, the shares, the true worth of the mill, into a trust none of them know exists. The will was bait. I had to see who'd reach for the money the second I was gone. Now I know. The house Vivian had just sold was mortgaged to the rafters. The shares Daniel had toasted were a minority slice of a company whose real value had already walked out the back door. Legally, cleanly, months before Harold died. They hadn't won the estate. They'd won the decoy. And by cutting Ellie out in front of the whole room, Harold had baited them into grabbing for the money in plain sight of the one witness who had kept the receipts for 40 years. Then Belle read the line that took the air out of Ellie's chest. The trust has a single name on it. The only person who ever tried to protect me instead of my money. Give it to her. All of it. He slid a second document across the desk. Her name was on every page. After that, it moved fast. Harold's evidence reopened the estate. His records, dated, signed, impossible to argue with, handed investigators the exact trail no one else had been able to build, and Vivian's history with 2 other families turned from rumor into a case. 6 careful years came undone in a matter of weeks. When the petition was filed, Vivian did what she had always done. She moved. She stopped answering her own lawyers. She let the house money slip into accounts no one could reach, and by the time the process server came to the door, she was already gone, out of the state, and then out of the country, to a place with no appetite for an Ohio court order. She would never sit in that courtroom and answer for a single dollar. But it no longer mattered whether she showed. Harold had built a case that could convict her from an empty chair. Daniel learned the empire he'd inherited was a shell, and that his father had read him from the start. And Eleanor, the traitor, the one who got nothing, was left holding nearly all of it. That could have been the end. Justice done, the schemers caught, the good daughter repaid. But there was a 4th page. Belle almost didn't read it, because it had nothing to do with money. It answered the only question Ellie had never let herself ask out loud. The handwriting on this page was softer, less steady. Ellie, if Thomas is reading you this, the rest is handled, and I can finally say what I couldn't while I was alive and being watched. You think I let them push you away? You think I believed their story about you? I never did. Not for one day. Then Harold explained how a watched, isolated old man had ever managed to move a fortune and slip a letter to his lawyer without his wife knowing. I had help. A hospice volunteer the agency started sending in my last months. A quiet woman Vivian never looked at twice, because she came in with the medical people. Vivian opened the door for her, the same door she'd bolted shut on my own daughter. Ellie stopped breathing, because in those final months, when she could not reach her father as his daughter, she had found the one way back in. She had signed on with the hospice agency as a volunteer in another county under her nurse's license. She had sat at his bedside in a mask, kept her head down, held his hand through the bad nights, and never told him who she was, because she believed the truth would only break his heart. She never knew that he had recognized her. Belle read the next line slowly. I've known your hands since the day you were born, Ellie. He let it sit. I put a chisel in them when you were 4 years old. Light touch. Let the tool do the work. Did you really think I wouldn't know them the moment they held mine again? He had said nothing that whole time. Night after night, he had let a stranger sit with him in the dark, because the stranger was his girl, and it was the only way they had left him to have her. He used those quiet hours, when Vivian thought he was fading in front of a volunteer who didn't matter, to plan every move that would one day bring her whole world down. Ellie sat very still as it landed. She was remembering a night about 3 weeks before the end, when the old man in that bed had held her hand a little too tightly and said, to a volunteer he was not supposed to know, "You're good to me, better than I deserve." She'd thought he was thanking a stranger. He had been saying goodbye to his daughter. She'd been inside the moment the whole time and never once known she was in it. "You didn't abandon me. You found the one door they couldn't lock. I didn't die alone, Ellie. I died with my daughter holding my hand. I just wasn't allowed to say your name. So I'm saying it now. Dad." Ellie put her head down on the lawyer's desk and wept. And Thomas Bell, 40 years of courtroom composure, turned his chair toward the window and let her. She never sold the mill. 140 families kept their work. In the front office hangs one small plaque with no name on it but her father's, and a single line underneath. He made things that last. Vivian's careful years collapsed under the weight of the very paper trail she thought she controlled. Daniel was left with his debts and the truth of himself. Months later, he turned up at Ellie's door, thinner, quieter, holding his hat like a boy in trouble. "I didn't know about the trust," he said, "but I knew about you. I let them say those things because it was easier than looking at what I'd turned into." Ellie held her brother's eyes a long moment. She didn't forgive him, not that night. But she didn't close the door either. "Dad left you exactly what he thought you could handle," she told him. "Go prove him wrong." It was more mercy than he had earned, and they both knew it. Somehow, standing next to what their father had done, the rest of it mattered less than it should. Because the thing Harold spent 2 years fighting to hand his daughter was never the mill, or the land, or the money. It was one sentence she had been terrified she would never get to hear. He knew. He always knew. And he loved her the whole way down. Here's what stays with me. Harold was sharp enough to see the trap and stubborn enough to build a better one. Most people are neither. Somewhere tonight, a lonely parent is being turned against the one child who's telling the truth, and there is no sealed letter coming to set it right. So let me leave you with the hard question. Was Harold right to let his own daughter believe he'd erased her, if it was the only way to save her? Or is that a cruelty, no love excuses? Tell me below. I'll be down there in the replies. And if this one stayed with you, the next one will too. A man sits down for the reading of his mother's will and learns she left everything to a woman no one in the family had ever met, a woman who, it turned out, had been dead for 12 years. It's on your screen right now. Subscribe and stay close. Because the truth always leaves a trail. You just have to be willing to open the envelope.